Guruve Gaura Chanjaya Radhikaya Tadale Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Tad Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vanchakalpaturubhyascha Kripa Sindhuvaye Vacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Dandavat, devotees, please forgive me. I'm a little bit tired. I had a pretty long night and early morning, as usual. But as a follow-up to a talk that I gave yesterday regarding the nature of the Jiva and the Jivas not falling from a direct relationship in the spiritual world with Sri Krishna. Some questions also arose from that I wrote in the thread that I would try to make a separate video, which is this one, to speak to those two considerations. It's very important in this particular discussion, which I'm hoping is not very long because I'm also having a late start in the day here for some other things, is that we tend to look for, and I think this may be foundational even before I get into explaining the sastric considerations, but just to explain the psychological implications of the question of our origin or genesis, or even causation of why we are in the material energy and why we are, quote, suffering, etc. The genesis of that question comes from the ahamkara. It is not a question that arises actually from the nature of the Atma, because it is a question that has self-interest. So it's not a question that looks at a ideal that if the Srishti Leela, means this material creation, is a pastime of Bhagavan, and that from time without any beginning I've been involved in this creation cyclically according to my karma, etc., etc., that the first consideration is not that it's Bhagavan's Leela or even what Bhagavan's intention is or relation is with my being in this particular conditioned state. But the first question is, why me? In other words, the nature of the question is, why am I here? So I want to track down causation to satisfy my sense of, based on ahamkara, my sense of personal justice as to why I'm here. Now, that may be more subtle in the sense that it turns into a philosophical or theological inquiry, but the genesis, the deep-rooted genesis of that question is, why me? Why am I here? Why am I suffering? Right? Now, it is a fact that Sri Sanatana Goswami Pad, in Sanatana Siksha, he asked this question to Sriman Mahaprabhu. Kya mi, kene jare tapatrai. Not only who am I, but why am I suffering in the threefold miseries of the material energy? So, it's not an unnatural question, but the motive behind the question is also important. If there is a sense that I need to find causation for my existence here in order to give a sense of justification, that's what leads down the track of finding a narrative that does not implicate Krishna, because the objective of love is Krishna, but we want a narrative that won't implicate Krishna in being responsible for my being here. And even when we turn that into self-examination and say, well, I will examine myself for the causation, then we also start to look at narratives under which I somehow made this choice and it had to be figured out somehow or another that I made the choice, but why did I make the choice, etc. Now, of course, we've already established yesterday that whatever the reasoning or causation is, it's not something that took place in the spiritual world. It's not that we were with Krishna and somehow some alternative consideration came into our consciousness somehow, and then we chose to misuse, quote, independence and come to the material world. First of all, it needs to be understood that the nature of free will is an ingredient in praying. It's not a true independence of the jiva. Because if you have independence to choose to leave the spiritual world, and you have independence in that high degree, couldn't you independently choose, I don't want to die, I don't want to go, right? Right? But you don't. You don't have absolute independence. The first verse of Sriman Bhagavatam claims that the only person who has absolute independence, or swarat, is Shri Krishna himself. And of course, that is imbued in all of the eternal associates of Bhagavan, etc., etc. But we don't have an absolute kind of free will that would have given rise to an ability to somehow misuse it in the actual spiritual environment where there's no Maya, etc., etc. So that idea that free will was the genesis or causation and a bad choice of coming into the material energy was not viable, and nothing related to falling from the spiritual world is actually viable. Now, other considerations start to come up in looking for that justification or that causation. And the second tier of ideas is that we fell from a marginal region, which is called tatastha. Because Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has described in his Jiva Dharma, especially in the 15th chapter, based on a question asked by Brajanath regarding tatastha swabhav. Brajanath asked Sri Gopal Guru Goswami to describe what is tatastha swabhav. So there, Goswamiji describes that tatastha swabhav is like, and I'm going to give a reference right now, because if you catch this reference, it will help to clarify all of the examples that are given by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and other acharyas, including even in the ancient texts like the Upanishads, right? Anytime you see words like, and I'll read an example here. This is from the Brihad Aranyakya Upanishad. Yatagni Shudra Vishpulinga Vyucharanti. So yatha means like. It's not saying it is giving an example like this. So in this particular example, it's saying innumerable jivas emanate from Para Brahman just like tiny sparks of fire. It's not saying, it's not an idea that there are innumerable jivas who weren't existing and then suddenly were continuously manifesting from Parabrahma. Because in just a cursory reading, we could glean that. But if we make Sangati, means connection with everything else we know about Jiva, we know that Jivas are eternal. So there's no question of an original genesis of the Jiva because they're eternal. You understand? So the Jivas are always existing. Krishna says, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. The Jivas are always existing. There's not a question of they came into existence at a certain point. Now, in the same way, we're trying to discuss if there was a genesis from this tatastha region of the Jivas coming into the material condition state. So in the same way, in the 15th chapter, to describe tatastha swabhav, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, using, speaking in the context in his samadhi of Brajanath's inquiry to Goswami, that like a fish exists in a large lake. So he takes an example from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, just like a fish who is in a large lake, swims from one bank to another, and observing both conditions, chooses one. So this is one of the examples he uses. In contemporary examples, my Guru Pada Padma used to say, like mustard seeds, fall onto the edge of a knife, and some fall one way and some fall the other. Right? So he made it as simple as that. Right? And in this way, different examples, which are more like narratives, to just explain really that there is no genesis of the jiva's conditioned life. It is anadi. I'm going to get to that point in a minute. But to try to satisfy that inquiry of the jiva based on their self-interest. It's about me. I want to know why I'm here, why I'm suffering, etc. To answer that, all these various examples are given and narratives are given to try to give some sense of placation to that inquiry. Now, if you read clearly the end of the 15th chapter of Jiva Dharma, Bhaktivinoda Thakur makes it very clear. I've spoken all of these things as examples. You should try to realize the actual siddhant in your chit samadhi by doing bhajan. Right? That's his actual conclusion on it. Right? So it is not that all of the things mentioned that we were in a region called tatastha, and it's from that region that we fell. And so many other sort of extrapolations have come from that. Like we fell from a spiritual world, and then we didn't fall directly from the spiritual world. We first came into the tatastha region, and then we fell. But there is no such place, no locus or locale called tatastha region. It is a swabhav. It means it is a nature. So the nature of the Atma is that it has the potentiality to come under the prabhav or influence of material energy, or to be permeated by the internal energy. That is what is called tatastha swabhav. It's not a locale. It's the very nature of the Atma, the tatastha jiva. It's the nature of the Atma. It can either be permeated by the Antaranga Shakti, Swarup Shakti, or in the absence of that Swarup Shakti, it can be influenced by the material energy. And the reason I did not say permeated by the material energy is because it's very clear in Sastra, asangahi anyam purusha, that actually the jivas never come in contact literally with the material energy. The entire material experience is a vicarious one, right? The three modes of material nature and the material energy is reflecting on the chitta, or the consciousness of the jiva. I've spoken this so many times. It's like a flat screen TV, for lack of a better example. And the jiva, situated in their own nature, observes, due to the lack of spiritual potency, they're observing their interaction with the material energy on their chitta. And because of that observation, they become imbued with what is called asmita, which is a feature of avidya. Asmita means I am, right? So our actual identity, so I'm hoping I'm making this all pretty clear. Our actual identity is dasosmi. I am the servant of Krishna. Mahaprabhu established that when Sri Sanatana Goswami Pada asked the question. He said, Jiva Hoye Krishna Nitya Das. So your actual identity is that you're Das of Krishna. But under the influence of avidya, the absence of that true spiritual knowledge is called avidya. The first thing that arises is called asmita, I am. In the rising of that concept of I am, the ahamkara from the energy of the material world is embedded. And that ahamkara says, I am the karana and karta of everything related to me. So I am the doer and the cause of everything related to me. And that is being applied to the material energy being reflected on the chitta. So now the only thing that's needed is a particular identity in the material world. And due to our karma, karmana, daivana, natrena, janto, dehopapatye, third canto Srimad Bhagavatam, it's explained that we go from one life to another with a particular karmic portfolio, and we get an upadi. Upadi means a particular karmic designation. I am John Doe, born to the Doe family, in this locale, with this particular social arrangement, etc., etc. So from asmi to ahamkara to upadi, we now have a complete false identity related to the material world that's all going on vicariously by the jiva's observation on his chitta of the influence of the three modes of material nature. This is why in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna has said, Prakriti kriyamanani gunai kamani savasha aham kara vimudatma kartamiti manyate. The jiva thinks he's doing all these things because he's bewildered by the false ego. Aham kara vimudatma. Understand? Because there's no spiritual potency, the jiva cannot have the ability to discern, oh, this is an illusion, this is not real. So the jiva buys into it, much in the same way if you're watching a movie or a drama or something, and you invest your consciousness there and you identify with the characters, with the plot, then your emotional state rises and falls according to what's being played out in that movie or that drama. So the Jivatma is doing the same thing with material energy. They're observing on the chitta that influence of material energy and going through the emotional roller coaster of it. But actually the Jivatma themselves are not in contact with material energy at all. So now, back to our point. So, since the tatastha is not a region, but it is actual state of the Jiva, that rules out the idea of having been staged in a place called tatastha region and having fallen from there. So that's the first sort of negation of a concept of falling from tatastha Shakti. There is no region called tatastha Shakti. There is tatastha Swabhava. And if you look in the 15th chapter of Jiva Dharma, that is made clear. Next is the idea that we have come from Brahman, and that the Jivas are coming out of the Brahman and then they come into the material world, right? Or go into the spiritual world, right? But again, the problem here becomes what becomes the basis of causation for that. In other words, why would some Jivas come out of Brahman and go one way, some Jivas go the other way? So then another layer of the narrative comes, well, to explain that it's like this or like that. Or sometimes a narrative could become as simple as I told my Guru Padapapa, I said, listen, just like mustard seeds fall on the edge of a knife and some go one way, some go the other. Part of the reason that sometimes narratives are given like this is because the real energy and capacity of the Jiva should be used in bhajan to create their perfection. The concentration of that energy to try to find the causation or genesis of our being here will only enrich and thicken our self-interest and hence our material identity and everything else. So Al Srila Prabhupada used to say, don't worry about how you got here. You should spend your energy and time to get out. Right? And of course, many devotees have adopted that as a sort of line of dealing with this whole issue. Right? But there is some Siddhantic realities here, and we want to deal with that as well. So, still thinking we've come from Brahman would give rise to various kinds of theological challenges. Right? So, if we've not come from tatastha because it's not a region, we've not fallen from the Brahman, right? What is the situation of how the Jiva's conditional life had its genesis and why? And more than that, why am I subject to conditional life where there's suffering, again quote, right? And not allowed or having been prearranged my establishment in the eternal abode? So this is the question. So again, if you go back to what I mentioned in the very beginning, the question itself is born from self-interest. I, me, right? It's about me. I need to get some justifications and some answers to my situation, right? So in the 16th chapter of Jiva Dharma, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur then begins to unfold a wonderful explanation in a very cuddling way, if for lack of a better word, to explain to the Jiva, first of all, that your existence in the conditional space has been anadi. That means from time without any beginning. So like yesterday, we have to have sastra praman for these things. I can't just make a statement. We have been conditioned, ongoing without having any sastric backing. So yesterday I also quoted the verse from Srimad Bhagavatam in the 11th canto, which says, Anadi avidya yuktasya purushasya vedatmanam svato na samabhantyanya ganatva ganado bhavet. Right? So there it's explained that the Jiva's connection, yukta, with avidya is anadi. So over the course of years also so much different sort of various views of what the word anadi means have been put on the table. But if you take the word as it is, anadi, something that has no beginning. Jiva Goswami in Tattva Sandarbha has given this explanation as well. Anadi means something that has no beginning, but it does have an end. Speaking to it in a philosophical, theological context, something has no beginning, but does have an end. Right? If you try to go beyond that understanding and you start, well, because Al Srila Prabhupada allowed the use of the word from time immemorial, which means from a time I could not remember. But the problem here is going to be, if you take that from time immemorial, which is just meant to essentially mean the same thing, if you can't remember it, what's the value point, right, in saying that the word anadi means time without any memory, right? But the idea here is that somehow people are bringing up the idea, but something was there that I just can't remember. That's the point that's why this term is being utilized. But then, rather than what Srila Prabhupada intended was, time immemorial, it's so far back you can't even remember it, let's go this way, let's go forward, a whole, conjecture comes about to validate so many other things. Well, yeah, before time I could remember means before that something happened, right? But literally the word anadi means without any beginning. So, if we take that statement of Srimad Bhagavatam and also anadi Krishna Bahirmukh, of the statements, we've been Bahirmukh from Krishna from Anadi Kal, Jiva Goswami and Paramatma Sandarbha, Anadi Parama Tattva Jnanam Samsara Bhava Maya. So many statements using this word, and we take it as it is, Anadi. It simply means that our conditioning has been from Anadi Kal, a time without any beginning. Right? Now, if there is self-interest, that's going to be problematic, because we're going to be looking for justification and causation of why. If there is no self-interest, if the only interest is in the seva of Krishna, anya abhilasita sunya, if there is no self-interest, then the fact, and Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur makes this point in the 16th chapter, therefore, when that's considered without self-interest, it does not matter if I've been here from Anadi Kal, because now that conditioned life is coming to an end, having entered into the shelter of bhakti. So actually, if there was a situation that I was from a time without beginning in a conditioned state, right? The fact that now I've come to the shelter of bhakti, this is irrelevant. That I was here from time without any beginning, or relating that I was here from time without any beginning. So now people have a problem because they'll say, well, wait a minute. You're kind of dismissing the fact that I had to suffer from time without any beginning. And you're just saying, well, just wipe that away. So I want to know why it is that I had to suffer from time without any beginning. I want an answer to that question. So now, if you really want to go deeper on that, we have to see if the jiva was actually suffering or not. So now, in the 21 qualities mentioned in Paramatma Sandarbha by Jiva Goswami of the Atma, one quality is Chit Ananda Atmika. Chit Ananda Atmika. In his own commentary to this particular section, he says, the Atma is Dukkha Pratyogita. Dukkha Pratyogita means, Pratyogi means something that's the opposite of something, or the antithesis of it. He's saying the actual nature of the soul, it is the complete antithesis or opposite thing of suffering. There is no suffering, dukkha, in the Atma itself. So now this raises the question, who are you? And you have to say, I'm the Atma, I'm the soul, I'm not the body. So if you're the Atma and you're the soul, did you ever really suffer? If the Atma is dukkha pratyogita, it has no suffering in the Atma. Who was suffering? Therefore, if the suffering is not in the Atma, and you had an experience you were suffering, what you want to try to do is see where that suffering came in. What is that suffering? And when you analyze it closely, you will see that suffering is the vicarious identification with material energy. It's not in the Atma, it's in the misconception that the Atma is the body. and has been several bodies over several lifetimes from time without any beginning. Gross and subtle bodies. But the Atma is eternal. And in the Atma, Chit Ananda Atmaka, there is no suffering. So the suffering is a mental idea, a concoction that I am this body, and hence I'm identifying with the body, gross and subtle, and I'm emotionally riding the roller coaster of suffering, happiness. Understand? Therefore, the search for causation of my conditioned life based on the need to find an answer, based on the need to have a justification for my suffering, has also been refuted here now. Because in reality, the Atma never suffered. The suffering only came by your vicarious identification with the material energy. That's a fact. You can't refute that. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur very lovingly and cunningly says, listen, even the associates of Bhagavan undergo difficulty. So I've often given this comparison when I have to speak on this particular point. Can you speak of a time when you're suffering, and it may have been in previous lives, but take this life because that's a metric you can relate to right now. Tell me the time when you were, as a young person, put into a house that was going to be set on fire, where your entire fortune and everything was taken away from you, where your father had passed away, where your relatives were continuously trying to kill you to the point where they created a huge war to accomplish that. So what I'm speaking to is the nature of what the Panchava Pandavas and their mother Kunti went through. Have you suffered like that? But Kunti tells, listen, I will re-embrace that same suffering over and over again simply to have the darshan of Shri Krishna. And in many other cases that you look at in the Leela of Bhagavan and his associates, Prahalad Maharaj, your father ever tried to poison you? He ordered that you should be stabbed to death by tridents by his associates. He threw you under an elephant, threw you off a cliff, personally tried to kill you. Yet Prahalad Maharaj never experienced, I am suffering. You don't read in the prayers of Prahalad Maharaj or anywhere within the entire Narsingha Prahalad Leela where Prahalad talks about his personal suffering. He speaks humbly about his condition in the Asuric Kul, means the family of Asuras, etc., etc. He speaks very humbly about his condition and his aspiration for spiritual, but he never speaks about his personal suffering. Now we could say, well, Nrsingadev spoke about it. Because even in our ignorance, Bhagavan is so loving, so kind, that he cuddles us in the mood, oh, listen, always I've been here as Antaryami, Super Soul with you, through all of your trials and tribulations, due to your misidentification with material energy. So now, my point here is to establish a couple of things. One is, there is not a genesis of a fall from a place called tatastha, nor falling from the bramhajoyti or Brahman. We continually have been in conditioned life without a beginning. Now, if we don't have self-interest, that would not be a problem. Because actually, again, as I expressed, the Atma never suffered. It was all a vicarious identification with the material energy. And therefore, Lord Brahma has one prayer which should be adopted by everyone. Tate anukampam sushamikshimano bunjam eva atma kritam vipakam. Whatever I think I have experienced is all due to first my identification with the material energy, but also due atma kritam. Whatever I've karmically done previously, the parabdha karma of that is manifesting in my life. So even in my identification with the material energy, whatever's happening to me, atma kritam, is a byproduct of my own karma. So of course we obviously can't blame Bhagavan in that regard. We also can't blame the material energy in that regard. Atma kritam. I am the krita, the cause of whatever happened as far as that is concerned. So when we come to that mind frame, that mindset, then in the absence of self-interest, we begin to understand that our entire sojourn of so-called conditioned life here from Anadikal is not such a big thing. First of all, in the in the view of whatever period of time this has been, to eternality, it is nothing. So whatever period that is, from Anadi Kal to the time you begin to come into your actual nature, your spiritual nature, that period of time is nothing related to eternality. That's one point. Secondly, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur makes the point, having gone through all of those things and then come to bhakti, only enhances the beauty of bhakti itself. Try to understand this. If there's not a self-interest, but there's a mood of truly wanting to serve and love God, one will think, all of this time of foolishness, everything else I went through has brought me to this point. Bhava appavarga brahmato yad bhavaj. And then having met a sadhu, right? Yarhi tasya achyuta satsangamaha. It's explained in Srimad Bhagavatam. Having come into achyuta satsanga, having met the high class of Guru Sadhu, now how loving it is that after all of that, what reprieve I have in that now, bhava pavarga, my sojourn in this world has come close to coming to its end. That's the meaning of this verse. Right? The bhava pavarga. Very soon, this apavarga, or apavarga will be happening. Pavarga means, in Sanskrit, there's one set of letters, pa, bha, ma, right? It means material existence. Right? Apavarga means coming to the place where that material existence is coming to a conclusion. It's wrapping up. Why? Achyuta satsangamaha. Because having come into contact with genuine sadhu is the indication of the end of your sojourn in the material world. So what Jiva Goswami Pad spoke, that anadi means something that has no beginning, but it does have an end. That end is at hand if you are practicing bhakti. Understand? So in that regard, we'll also say that now just look, like if there's so much trials and tribulations in a relationship, but in the end, so much growth comes in that relationship, and the quote love, because I've mentioned the material world, really love is not a real thing, but just for example's sake, a couple goes through so many trials and tribulations, but then because of those trials and tribulations, it creates so much strength in their love that their relationship becomes heightened. In a realistic sense, the trials and tribulations of the Jiva from Anadi Kal, quote, in this world, have produced a stage in which Sanatana Goswami Pad to Mahaprabhu, he says, listen, I'm willing to give all these things up. So I'm asking, tell me truly who I am and why I was suffering. And when Mahaprabhu gives him the answer, right? Jivera Swagoya Krishna Nitya Das, Jivera tatastha Shakti Veda Ved Prakash. He gives him the answer. Oh, now go on, go on. And Mahaprabhu explains the whole process of bhakti to him. Right? Of course, Sanatana Goswami Pad is eternal associate of Mahaprabhu and Lavanga Manjari and Krishna Lila. So, for our sake, this Lila is taking place to give us this teaching. That now we've come to the process of bhakti. So really, the causation and genesis of our conditioned life is not really such a big thing overall. And our Srila Prabhupada, other acharyas, have also made it like that. In terms of the Siddhanta, we do have to have theological clarity, because we cannot say people fall out of the spiritual world. That would be improper. On a more subtle basis, right, Siddhantically on a more subtle basis, narratives regarding tatastha as a region or the bramhajoyti as a place of genesis, all these have come under discussion, but we've just shown actually the nature of the jiva has been, his conditioned life has been from time without any beginning. Let me read one more thing. I'm going to have to grab it directly. Let me see if I have it here. First of all, I may not have it on here. So I'll give the reference for it. Oh, no, I do have it. Give me a second. Okay, so I do happen to have it. I've got books everywhere. My good wife is always mentioning the book should stay on the library shelf, but my habit is to have them everywhere. All right, so we're going to go to Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13, and we will go to text number 20. And this is the verse to verse, but then also the commentary by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. So his commentary on Bhagavad Gita is called Sarartha-Varshini. Sarartha-Darshini is his commentary on Srimad Bhagavatam. Sarartha-Varshini, Tika, is his commentary on Bhagavad Gita. And he asks and answers this question. That's why I'm going to reference it here. So in verse number 20 in chapter 13, it says, Prakriti Purusha Cha Eva Vidya Anadi Uboapi. The connection of the Jiva with Prakriti means material energy via avidya is Anadi. Vikrmascha Gunamscha Eva Vidi Prakriti Sambhavan. Know both Prakriti and the Purusha to be without beginning, and know their transformations and qualities to be born of Prakriti. Right? So now, Bhavanuvad, this is the explanation of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakurpad. After explaining Paramatma, Sri Bhagavan is now explaining the Jivatma, the Purush, who is also Kshetragyan. Kshetragyan means the knower of the field, meaning his own existence, right? Why did the relationship between the Kshetragyan and Maya Prakriti occur, and when did it start? Listen to this. Expecting this question, Sri Bhagavan answers with this shlok, beginning with Prakriti. Maya, material nature, and the Purusha, the Jiva, are both without beginning. That is, their cause has no beginning, because they are the energy of me. So in other words, he's saying the connection between the Jiva and Prakriti has no genesis. It is Anadi. It wasn't that there was, and Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is certainly competent to have given any explanations of another alternative. But he's saying, no, the nature of the connection between Prakriti and the Jiva is Anadi. Understand? So if you want the reference for this, it's going to be, again, chapter 13, verse number 20 in Bhagavad Gita, and the commentaries of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakurpad. Right? So, hopefully this gave some insight into the idea of how other kinds of conceptions have arisen in terms of the genesis of the Jiva in conditional life, either falling from a region called tatastha or coming out of the Brahman, etc., etc. So, base facts, the Jiva's conditional life is Anadi. And therefore, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in the 15th chapter of Jiva Dharma makes this clear when he says, all Vaishnavas know the Jivas are eternal, and they exist in two categories, Anadi or Nitya Bhada and Nitya Siddha or Nitya Mukta. So in other words, the Jiva is in one condition or the other. Nitya Mukta or Nitya Siddha Jivas, eternally imbued with Swarup Shakti, reside in the divine realm. Those Jivas who are not imbued with Swarup Shakti experience from time without beginning conditioned life, but that conditioned life comes to an end upon the first influence of Swarup Shakti in the form of Shraddha, coming from the contact with a sadhu or guru, etc. Now, another whole question could be, well, why is there any of this anyway? Why is there a material world anyway? Why do we have to have this different spiritual world, material world? Why didn't Bhagavan just make all the jivas in the spiritual world? So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in the 16th chapter also answers that by saying, Krishna's Lila Mahi. Lila Mahi means that Krishna likes to enjoy all kinds of Lila. So in the Chaitanya Charitamrita it's mentioned there, Shvankcha Vibhinamsa Rupahana Vishtara Ananta Vaikunte Brahmananda Karena Vihara. That Krishna, in his personal expansions and with all jivas, right, right, enjoys pastimes, Ananta Vaikunta, in all the spiritual domain, and Brahmananda, also within the material creation. So this is called Srishti Leela. It is actually a Leela of Bhagavan. So there are many esoteric reasons why Bhagavan has a Srishti Leela, and so forth and so on, right? So I don't want to get, because then we'll start to get off into another track. So don't have the idea that the appearance within the material Jagat by Krishna is simply because the jivas who are full of faults are here. He has to come for that. Because if you read carefully any descriptions of Krishna's coming to the material world, it always begins with Paritranaya Sadhunam, to give pleasure to the sadhus. Anugrahaya Bhaktanam, to give pleasure to my bhaktas. So that indicates that there's always also pure devotees here on the planet. Also, there are leelas which are appropriate to Krishna's material not material pastimes, but his leelas within the material jagat. There are certain pastimes in Krishna's prakat leela that Krishna does not perform in his aprakat leela. Like Mathura Gamana, Dwarka Gamana, going to Mathura Dwarka, does not happen in the spiritual world. The actual prasana of demons does not happen in the spiritual world. Right? Sudur Pravas. The idea of Krishna literally going to Dwarka and creating the mood under which Sudur Pravas exists, and hence, by meeting again, Samriddhiman Sambo. So we'll get off of our subject matter if we try to go down that track. So Krishna has his own desires for appearing within the context of his material creation, his prakat lila. At the same time, in that verse, Anugrahaya Bhaktanam Manushinam Dehinam Astita. Tad bhajate, what is this? Tad Kitraso bhajate, Tad bhajate Kitraso. If anyone will hear it, Yakshutva Tat Paro Bhavet. If any jivas will hear the narrations of Krishna's pastimes in all of his various incarnations, when he comes into the prakat realm, then, Tadrasi, bhajate Tadrasi Kritva, then they will develop bhakti. I hope I'm not misquoting this verse. Anyway, they will develop bhakti from hearing these pastimes. Therefore, at the end of that verse, it says bhavet. Bhavet in Sanskrit is an imperative. You must therefore hear this Harikatha of Krishna's leelas and his leelas in other incarnations. Narasingha Leela, right? Shri Ram Leela, so many. Right? You have to hear these. These will invoke bhakti in the heart of the conditioned jivas. So hopefully this explanation helped to understand, first of all, the idea of asking questions regarding our genesis and looking for justified causation is really born from self-interest. Because if you really thought about it, and suppose Krishna literally said, I'm going to put you here and I want you to suffer. Krishna is your object of love and worship. I'm going to put you here and I want you to suffer. If there was a such thing as suffering for the Atma. Would you have a problem with that? Many devotees are probably saying, yeah. Because they don't have Anya Abhilas. They're not thinking only Krishna's desire. Therefore, Mahaprabhu, in teaching 8 verses, in the last verse he taught, even if you make me brokenhearted by not appearing before me or handle me roughly by your embrace, still you are my worshipful Lord unconditionally. This is called unconditional love. If you have a challenge in your heart that Krishna could take me and do anything he wants with me, it means there's work to be done in the manner of growing to a state of loving unconditionally. Understand? And what's so amazing is we look for that in the material world, but we won't think about that or look for that in relation to the true object of love, which is Shri Krishna. But Shri Krishna is so merciful. He stayed with you through all of this in the form of Antaryami. How merciful is Krishna? How merciful is Shrimati Radharani? That she's brought into your purview through the prasana of a sadhu guru bhakti. How much love they have for you. They themselves came in the avatar of Sriman Mahaprabhu, full of love and mercy. Chirarattadam nija guttavitam swanama premamritatyudara apamra yovitatara gaur. And they imbued in Harinam the secret to obtain the highest kind of love, even up to Radhadasya Manjari Bhav. How much love and affection they have for you. So don't have self-interest. Don't think I was suffering or I have to find justification for why I was here. It is simple. Anadi Avijja Yuktasha. The connection has been anadi, but it does have an end. So be very happy I've come to bhakti, and help others also to come. That's how you repay this debt. Help others also to come to bhakti. Understand? So in this way, do not be upset, do not have self-interest, and therefore the need to find all kind of theological explanations, many of which start to go outside the purview or outside the lines of actual Siddhant. Understand? All right, my Dandavat Pranam devotees. Vanchakalpatruvishcha Kripashindavevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.